Welcome to this wānanga. Tūturu is a space to hold robust and enlightening discourse, an in-depth, unapologetic and unforgiving wānanga, bringing together experts. Very rarely do we get the opportunity to have a proper wānanga about colonisation.
Tino Rangatiratanga is about our autonomy, our authority, our rights that were secured for us by our tupuna.
Today's episode is about Tino Rangatiratanga and mana Motuhake. These are both words that have become catch cries for times of protest. But at its core, it's a lot deeper than that. Our guests in this wānanga are environmental and human rights activists Bianca Ranson and Te Otane Huata, Māori lawyer Dayle Takitimu, and Māori researcher Tina Ngata. It's a deep chat e wama, so strap in. First up, what is mana Motuhake?
If we break the kupu down to mana and Motuhake, I look at the Motuhake part, and Motuhake to me means something that's unique, special, and just relates to us, as in our taonga tuku iho, our mātauranga Māori, our tikanga, our kawa, those things that make us unique to the world.
You know, there's a notion of independence, which means it can't be taken away by somebody else. It's not dependent on somebody else. When we're talking about, for me, mana Motuhake, it's intrinsically tied into concepts of mana atua, mana tangata, and so therefore is also tied into the taiao and our relations. When I think about mana in that space, in all of its different forms, it can't be taken away from whakapapa. And so it gives it a connection across time as well as across our world. I so often hear mana Motuhake talked about in ways where it absolutely can be interrupted. So people who talk about, oh, you know, this is mana Motuhake, but you don't hold the purse strings. Somebody else holds the purse strings. They can take the resourcing away from it. Well, then it's not mana Motuhake. Or you hold mana Motuhake, but you're not the ultimate leader, or you don't have the ultimate say over whether or not. Well, that's not mana Motuhake. Mana Motuhake is untouchable, it's yours, and it can't be interfered with from external spaces. For me, that's mana Motuhake.
I think especially from people who wouldn't understand the worldview.
Yes.
Which are the ones that tend to be the ones that try to interrupt mana Motuhake.
In a political, civil rights, Indigenous rights space, we sort of talk about inherent rights. And for me, that mana Motuhake would be a close expression of that, as opposed to sometimes people talk about an Indigenous pursuit of sovereignty, and I think that's quite a different concept from a different worldview and a different system, the idea of sovereignty, whereas I think mana Motuhake is sort of seen as much more organically ours and obviously referenced within our worldview. I feel like it's representative of a kind of collection of ideas, really, in terms of the independence. I agree with you. I think we have I'm not sure if it's a requirement, but definitely a whakapapa basis for that. I would say idea of its connection to the whenua, or our connection to the whenua, and by extension the deriving of mana or authority from our connection with the land and our relationship with the land. Just the same as I think you can have tapu motuhake, those sorts of things. And there's a lot, I think, in a political space that's focused on mana. It's part of the nature of the political space we've found ourselves in, to find an expression for the independence of our authority from a colonising power. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's an easy thing to define though by any stretch.
Thank goodness Dayle was able to make that clear. It's a tough thing to begin to unpack. Now, before we delve deeper into this wānanga, I hope you're not all expecting to leave this with one definitive answer, because I don't know if there ever will be one answer, because it means something very unique to every individual. So, what then is Tino Rangatiratanga?
Tino Rangatiratanga is about our autonomy, it is about our authority, and it's about our rights that were secured for us by our tupuna.
Yeah, I guess to some extent, mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga are used a little interchangeably nowadays. In terms of, I think they look to reflect a similar idea in terms of our full authority to be self-determining, self-governing, in charge of our decisions, our definitions, deciders of our strategic trajectory. And I think at its crux, Tino Rangatiratanga again is about the mana and the tapu that we have inherently as mokopuna upon this earth. And again, I think the expression of that comes through in a collective way.
To me, Tino Rangatiratanga is being free to be who we want to be. Based on the kōrero that we just had about mana motuhake and how that mana is given to us by mana atua, our whakapapa, mana tangata, mana whenua, mana moana, then but actually gives us the authority to determine our own destiny through the vehicle of rangatiratanga. So, though I do think that there's a misconception in terms of what the term rangatira means, to me, as we know, if we strip that kupu, it's made up of ranga, which is the raranga, and the tira, which is bringing people together. And we often have this idea that when we elect someone as part of a Western way of appointing our leaders, we look to them as only the people that have the decision-making power to determine the future of our people. But when we look at that kupu, we cannot have only one rangatira. It's actually, when we put it in the framework of a marae, the success of that marae is dependent on how well it's functioned on all parts. So that's the people that are at the front, and just as important are the people in the back. Rangatira to me is recognising that it's not just one person, but it's actually the community that's involved.
Within the current system is why it's so problematic when we are within this centralised, imperial, hierarchical system for people to very casually throw around terms like rangatiratanga, because rangatiratanga for me is also decentralised. Because it's so dependent upon the relationships to place and relationships to people, that if I'm sitting, 1,000 kilometres away from that awa that needs to feed those people, that needs for them to have abundance and live in community and live in connection to their taiao and maintain their mana, how can I claim to be a rangatira if I am not able to make the decisions to secure the well-being of that awa and the whānau and the interdependent relationships that are connected to it as well. So there's a notion of connectivity to place and to people that informs your rangatiratanga, and it necessarily has to be decentralised and doesn't fit well within a centralising system that is based in Wellington and claims to have the authority to make decisions around the whole nation. Rangatiratanga is necessarily flax roots up, is necessarily having an awareness of the people in your community, but also your community, your taiao community as well, and its needs and what you need to be doing as a rangatira to keep them all in relationship to each other. And if you can't do that, you won't be a rangatira for long. Yeah. Which is the difference to sovereignty, because you can be a sovereign, hold on to a sovereign status for a long time within a Pākehā system and completely erode and corrode and claim an entitlement to those relationships. Rangatira are there to secure those relationships for everybody, otherwise you won't stay one for long.
So that was a really fast breakdown of what mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga are. And I hope you're following. Essentially, mana is innate. It's a birthright and cannot be removed. Mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga are about the protection of our birthrights from external interference. It's about us regaining political authority over these rights to ensure our collective and environmental well-being now and into the future.
I was thinking about an example of a a powerful expression of rangatiratanga. And I'm thinking of rāhui and the way that the understanding of what's happening in the moana, the hui that had to bring the people together, including your wider community, to talk about what's happening in that space, to decide whether or not everyone, allow everybody in the space to have a say on what they think about, a rāhui on these paonga, and then making the decision that the rāhui is going to be placed.
For those who may not know, a rāhui is a collective decision made by iwi of a particular area when they put restrictions on a boundary, most commonly seen now when a tragedy may occur and a deceased has washed up on the shores, or supplies in the moana are running low. A rāhui or ban is put in place to stop people from taking kai, to give the environment an opportunity to rejuvenate.
The placement of the rāhui, that being a directive to the government, not asking for permission. So it's an expression of our ability to do that, not only if it's around, looking after the taiao, but whether that's the way that we house our people, the way that we grow our kai. It's us having the discussion, the kōrero, the mandate of the collective to then have that as an expression of our rangatiratanga. And our relationship with the government around that is not our need to ask for permission for those things, but to say this is the decision that's been made, and now you can use your processes to then to hold that through your 186A temporary closure application process. But the actual rangatiratanga in that is through the process of making the collective the decision, the expression of self-determination, and then taking that out as an expression of Tino Rangatiratanga.
There's a key difference between rangatiratanga as self-determination, which can occur without the crown, and Tino Rangatiratanga as a political authority. For a rāhui to effectively stop commercial fishing and public interference, it needs to be recognised as a political authority. This is crucial when discussing he whakaputanga and te tiriti. The main issue is not about our ability to express our rangatiratanga, but having it respected as the ultimate authority, Tino Rangatiratanga.
When I'm thinking of how we translate these sort of concepts to Pākehā or English, I have trouble. So even the concept of tapu, it's something that I just know within myself. Or mana, I know within myself, but to try and make it understandable to others, it can be quite a challenge. And so when you say the kupu sovereignty might not be the kupu that that may be a translation of this, what sort of ways could we really understand it if you don't know it within yourself?
I guess I'm less inclined to make it understandable to others outside of our worldview and outside of our culture, because it's like inherently within our framework, and obviously more keen that we have an understanding of that. I get weary about the idea of defining things within particular parameters to make them necessarily like accessible or understood by a kind of wider space that might not have the whole framework and whole reference point for it. And speaking of mana motuhake, I think, again, with that idea of self-determination, we get to determine what that means, and that might mean that it moves and shifts in our lifetimes or throughout our generations or from day to day for us, because our expression of those things will change and is able to, and I think there's a massive amount of freedom inside that. And I think ultimately the right to be self-determining, which is protected in law, is the right to our freedom. And so that means we can express our mana motuhake in any given way in accordance with our tikanga the way we want to. And it doesn't have to be sort of nailed down like that's in and that's out.
Yeah, kia ora.
Yeah.
It's also important to remember that we have a pretty real history of whakaaro Māori being translated into English, and it meaning or at least being interpreted completely differently. You only need to look at Te Tiriti o Waitangi and look where that translation got us.
I think there's some issue too with the corruption of the conceptual integrity of our ideas. When we've needed to use them, and honestly sort of in the onslaught of colonisation, which has been coming at us thick and fast, in every dimension we can possibly imagine, to grab for the toolkit, our customary toolkit, and say, this is my mana motuhake, this is my Tino Rangatiratanga, this is my expression of these things. Sometimes there becomes a thwarting of those things. We're grabbing from the toolkit for a functional reason, normally protective, or to make inroads in spaces where otherwise it would be colonial violence. But what you have then with the system very cleverly then co-ops those ideas and says, oh yeah, we'll provide a space for your mana motuhake, we'll provide a space for your rangatiratanga, your tapu, your mana, and those sorts of things. Your mana. Mana's got a lot of A's in a colonial. So, and then what happens is we start picking up on some of the language underneath that. So we've had times talking about our mana over places, our ownership of things. This idea that things belong to us as opposed to us belonging to them, or that symbiotic relationship that we might have. It really is, humans probably, that's the most we could expect, is this idea that we would have a secure symbiotic relationship in an ongoing way, not necessarily that we got to put dibs and ownership over everything. So, we got into these legal spaces where we were fighting for mana whenua, mana moana, and it's like instead of te mana ake or te moana, it became an expression of human authority over particular spaces. And of course, the linguists amongst us would have an unpacking of what's Tino Rangatiratanga, what's mana motuhake. The composers would have a perspective. Those that are esteemed tohunga and tikanga would have their own perspective of the origins of those ideas, the nako of those ideas, and how they've come down to their modern expression. Whereas I'm sort of conscious, we're sort of approaching it, I guess, with a particular political lens in terms of the colonisation or interruption to us, and that might have its own kind of thwarting of how we pick it up and understand it or run with it. And I guess I feel like there's been more consciousness and awareness about that in the recent past, where we're pulling ourselves and each other up to say, oh, hang on, like that comes from us, but that particular way of expressing it, weaponizing it, or twisting it within a colonial frame has now got us to a funny outcome. And I see that time and time again. And obviously for me, the more a colonial system touches our concepts, the harder they get to protect. And the more we import or have that. People talk like that cross-pollination is good, but I don't think it's necessarily good for the conceptual integrity of our ideas of who we are.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. But I guess colonisation has rightly made us very careful about trying to mix our own concepts with tauiwi, because they will never see the world through our eyes.
There's something that never sits comfortable with me is when I hear people go, oh, they took away my mana. Oh, I have to go to that hui to get my mana back. I'm like, how are you treating your own mana? You don't. It's not something somebody can take off you, but enhanced or impacted upon based upon your relationships and your contribution for collective well-being. And that's why sometimes, words like sovereignty, they stick in the craw. They don't marry up with concept of mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga as they relate to your ability to look after the collective. You can be a sovereign and absolutely be a tyrant and run over the collective and still be a sovereign. You know what I mean? So that's one of the things why, you know, sovereign comes from a different power framework on another land that is very much to do with domination and not to do with looking after the collective across time and also around you.
Tino Rangatiratanga e mana motuhake needs special focus. And when making decisions based on these concepts, a few things need to be taken into account.
We have that inherent responsibility and connection to te taiao, to each other, and when we're making decisions and an expression of our self-determination or our expression of who we are and where we're from, it's made collectively, and it's based on those that are suffering the most. You know, those, and it has input from tamariki, from our kaumātua, from everybody as a collective decision. So a real form of deep democracy that has specific responsibility to the whenua, to the atua, and to each other. And I think with mana as well, if we look at that in terms of the concept or the meaning of it, and even around our economy, is completely different, you know, to this like capitalism that we're currently kind of living in. So I think the most important thing for me about mana motuhake is that we know that it's about all of our people and all of our people who are struggling the most, and it's our ability to decide what kind of kai we grow, how we distribute our kai, how we look after our moana, what our mātauranga is about our taonga species and how our ecosystems are being affected, and how we manage that with rāhui. And only we can make those decisions, only we can determine what mana motuhake is for each whānau, for each hapu. And we need to make sure that we protect that, because the government and the Westminster system will do everything that they possibly can to take that out of our control and away from us. But the reality is that they can't. And so for me, that's what mana motuhake is. It's very specific, and it also relates to tapu and to Māori and to utu. And the biggest part of it for me is that it is the opposite of the system that we are currently experiencing, and it is the absolute most important pathway forward for the well-being of all of our people, to make sure that nobody is homeless, nobody is without kai, and making those decisions together collectively.
Tino Rangatiratanga and mana motuhake are words often spoken of today. Every protest, many waiata, and many stands of solidarity all mention these concepts.
Without accepting that there's a legitimate right to our mana motuhake, and to have to even fight for it, you know, we're certainly not asking for it, but even to fight for space for it to breathe within these political structures, it's like our legitimate right to our mana motuhake is the same as every other people's right to their self-determination, their right to live their lifeways the way they want to. And yeah, I think without that, you enter into that superiority, inferiority space where it's like you have to ask somebody else's permission. And as we were talking, I was thinking, how would I explain mana motuhake to one of my kids if they just came up? Hea tēnā mea mama, te mana motuhake. Me taku whakauti ki a rātou, tō ake mana. Ki te tūiroti tēnei ao. The expression of your own mana in this world has its legitimate place. You have a right to occupy that space, and you have a right to occupy that space in accordance with the tikanga, the laws and the culture of your tipuna.
And nobody else has the right to deny you that space. And that's for me the motuhaketanga, it is that there's a space for you that nobody else has a legitimate right to deny to you. You don't have to ask them for permission. You don't have to ask them to grant it to you. It's yours, and that's the motuhaketanga aspect of it, is that it's free of permissions for you.
there's been some instances, certainly in our recent history, that it's been used as a catch cry for rallying or uniting us under a particular political kaupapa. But I think the idea of it comes right from the beginning of our world in terms of it's just an expression of a state of being and a state of being that we are entitled to, as every other people on this earth, you know, we talk about this sort of family of nations, are also entitled to. And I think it just becomes a way that we describe that as opposed to something that we are bestowing upon someone. The very nature of it is like, kei roto i a koe, tēnā tapu, tēnā mana.
But I think there's a really important point also in what you've just raised there, which is, you know, when we were talking about how our historical experiences are reflected in our mōtea and haka. And so even though these concepts, I'm always loath to say something never happened in the times of our tupuna, because we're talking about a long time and a broad scope, and I don't like to homogenise, you know, our realities in that space. So I don't like to say, oh, something didn't exist or didn't happen, but you can certainly see that when something is compromised, that issue rises to the forefront in our expressions, in our haka, in our motete, and the concept of mana motuhake, I think you can see rising to the forefront of our collective consciousness, coming through in the compositions of the time where it became most compromised, most challenged.
Mana motuhake was never spoken about by our ancestors. They are hard things to define because they were a part of what our ancestors just did.
When we already had ultimate civilization, we already had deep democracy, we just didn't need a label on it.
Not so much, because I don't think it was under threat. It was the water and air and oxygen we lived in, you know. And I think picking up on your point, you know, what we've all talked about is this connection to whether it be taiao, whenua, or our tikanga. And I think that's an important point. In some spaces we say mana motuhake, Tino Rangatiratanga, because we're engaged in a political discussion. But none of those rights in our te ao Māori worldview would be considered absolute. They're always fettered by, you know, we're very quickly, you know, te motuhake tanga o tō mana, but in accordance with our tikanga, or, you know, in accordance with the taiao. And I think that's an important point. We didn't have a concept of unfettered rights. We had rights that were non-absolute because they were subject to the taiao and they were subject to the collective. And they were subject to our tomorrow because we had an inbuilt idea of intergenerational equity.
Kia ora.
And so I think that idea, on the one hand, we sort of say mana motuhake, it's the absolute of our expression of mana, and sometimes that can look like completely absolute and unfettered. And I think really importantly inside, when it's discussed and housed within our framework and our tikanga, it's understood quite differently. It's always fettered.
Yeah, but those are internal fetters, not external interference.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. That's the mana motuhake is free of external interference, but it's fettered by internal factors of your relationships, your behaviour, your choice, your contribution to the collective. Those are those internal fetters of tikanga that are so important to maintaining it.
What I have never really understood is our responsibility as tangata whenua to this whenua. They are so interconnected. It is our duty.
Because you talk about that almost like so inherently part of how we talk about mana. You're like, but of course the taiao's there, but of course the collective's there, but of course this concept of economy, oranga's there, you know?
Because it's all tied into, for me, mana. And I feel like it's also the difference between mana and power. You know, power like what we currently see in with the government, and the expression of power and how that power is attained through their version of democracy, and how people attain this power, and then how often people get to vote, and what they actually are allowed to do during that time that they hold that power without the consensus of the collective. But if we look at mana, it is the absolute. It's dependent on relationships, on whanaungatanga, of being earned all the time. It's not a once every 3 years and then you can just go with the power. You have the power to put the power in the hands of 3 ministers to decide, how they're going to extract from our moana, from our whenua.
Wow. I suppose the fact that I'm mind-blown by Bianca's kōrero just shows how colonised we have become in the way that we think. Because of course, but we have been taught to think differently.
Yeah, I'm just really interested in how that actually looks like. I think that there's a kōrero that's out there that simply says, I'm Māori, I've got mana motuhake, tanga. Whereas both Whai Tina and I have had the kōrero previously talking about, can we just have mana motuhake and just be proud to be Māori and that's enough? And when we think about it in terms of the collective, that can be dangerous because we aren't actually thinking about not only our literal mokopuna, we're not actually thinking about everyone else. And so can we really express mana motuhake by yourself if you aren't part of the collective?
But we're never not part of a collective. Because my whakapapa comes with me everywhere I go. I could stand on the top of a hill and defend it on behalf of a territorial invader, Koauanaki. Yes, that's an expression of mana motuhake-tanga. But I'm not there as an individual. I'm there with all of my tipuna and all of the tapu of my whakapapa and all of my descendants are there. I am a collective. My expression of my mana o te whakatīnanatanga o tēnā is always going to be inherently collective because I am a collective. I'm not, people just might see, an individual in terms of one physical tinana, but that's again with eyes that are not Indigenous. So yeah, I suppose to come huri-rona to your question, maybe it can't be expressed as an individual at that level because to what extent are any of us individuals?
There's a level of conscientisation about that though.
Inception.
Right? So I think if you're conscientised in that way, sure, yes, definitely, because you can hold that space, you can speak to that space.
Do we know what conscientised means? Pretty much, it's when the opportunity has been given to you to learn a particular way. Your ideas and thoughts have been moulded to think a particular way.
If you're not conscientised in that way, if you're not carrying and aware of your mana, and you're not expressing that mana motuhake in that way, yeah, I'm wary of it. I'm wary of people standing by themselves and talking about mana motuhake in a way that's divorced, because for me it is so heavy. It's so tied into connections to other concepts, not just connections to other people and other collectives, but connections to other concepts as well. I think it plays into the colonizers' game really well when you divorce it from the collective, and when you divorce it also from political authority. And I think that's honestly why you see it rolled out in policy bills and legislation, because it creates a false finish line. Why do we need to strive for political power? We already have mana motuhake. You already have mana motuhake. You know?
We gave it to you last week.
I gave it to you last week in that last policy. Didn't you read it? And so, I think we need to look after those connections. Yeah. Again, it comes to like looking after those connections. That yes, I have it as a part of my whakapapa, but I also cannot divorce it from the concept of political authority and my responsibilities to the collective as well.
Since these things are being contested, we now hear a lot about mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga used and entrenched into some of our waiata and haka, sung about as a way of informing, understanding and expressing emotions around these issues.
In answer to your question, I think I would test it by saying, kei ahau tōku ake mana motuhake. I believe that, I know that. like I have my own mana, my own tapu. Is it contextualised within the fact that I'm a mokopuna of Apanui, that I'm a mokopuna of Ngāti Porou, that I have this interrelationship with the whenua, with all of you? Yes, of course it's contextualised that way, but I think too, there is the collective, of course, that, and I think that's really where mana motuhake gets the strength of its expression. Yeah. But I do think at a personal level, you're a constituent part of that. We're parts of that. We're part of the component parts that make up the collective. So we have our individual expressions of that, or we have our individual accountability to that. We have a waiata, sort of waiata haka back home. Tōku mana Māori, he mana Māori motuhake, e heke iho maira i a toi te huatahi. Start right from our ancestral connection to our whakapapa to each other. Because from toi, we're all, able to sort of make those connections back to each other, but it sort of anchors it into the land and anchors us to that, right from the opening of that waiata that then goes on to sort of go through various sort of whakapapa relationships. But when we look sort of for the crux of that, the pito of that, our interconnection with each other just seems inescapable as an ingredient inside mana motuhake discussion. And I do feel that's where a lot of decision making and this idea of power has thwarted things, because they don't start from relationships, they don't start from te tapu o te tangata or te tapu o te taiao, and how to enhance or live in harmony with those things. It's really just strip everything at all costs, this masters of the universe mentality. Again, it's the same superiority complex they rode in on the endeavour. It's this idea that, you can and are entitled to push the earth and everybody on it to its absolute limits for your temporary little satisfaction, your jollies at the moment, and that's obviously deeply problematic.
And the arrogance, the arrogance of it, because at the end of the day, obviously Papa Tuanuku going to do what Papa Tuanuku needs to do, and we know that it's Indigenous peoples paying the first and worst price for climate crime and injustice, and all of that, the hara that's done to Papa Tuanuku. But nobody gets to escape it. Nobody gets to escape the ultimate consequence for assuming yourself to be at the top of a hierarchy of domination.
The rich billionaire's just going to find another planet, apparently. And but it's like that mentality.
Now's a good time.
But it's that mentality, like we'll just exhaust our way through this because we're entitled to, and then we'll just find somewhere else. And it's
like I said at the beginning, I hope you didn't come here expecting to get one answer around Tino Rangatiratanga or mana motuhake. When holding these things into account, there are certain responsibilities that come with decision making.
When we look at our moana and we're looking at our taonga species, which are all of the species in the moana, and just in my grandparents' generation, they could go down to the tide in knee-deep water and pick out kaura and paua, and these are functionally extinct now, and then we look at the governance of 100 years has led to ecosystem collapse because they treat each species as an individual, discrete species to extract, putting money above any kind of understanding of the relationship between and interdependence and holding the fabric of our Māori together within those spaces. And so when we look at whether it's our taiao or our people, the whenua, it's the same mentality. It's the same mentality that is leading our species to extinction, that our water is being polluted, our people are living in poverty. And so because of our whakapapa connection, and like you said, that it's tapu, that relationship, that whakapapa is tapu, so we have to make sure that we are making decisions that are appropriate and related to our tikanga and our practices and our mātauranga and everything that's been passed down to us, but that it's the collective, it's the understanding and input from everyone for the understanding of those decisions and how they're made. But yeah, I think it's just really interesting, like what we're talking about is the complete, flip of what we're currently experiencing.
Gaining your understanding of mana motuhake and Tino Rangatiratanga is important because you might find that you have a different interpretation of it compared to someone who has been brought up differently based on your environment, your surroundings, and the way that you're living your life. However, as tangata whenua, as Indigenous, these beliefs cannot be separate from our responsibility to the environment, and they can't just be self-serving. They must be in the best interest of the collective, whoever your collective has become. Tēnā koutou.